The Eastern Theatre. I first attended your workshop in the late 90s at the Jewish Book Fair, and again several years ago in St. Louis. Since childhood, I had been seeing pictures of what seemed to be history from different time periods. Whether reading or listening in history classes in school or watching movies, I would sometimes experience the events depicted very dramatically, as though I were actually there and seeing, hearing, smelling, and feeling those things around me. One past life experience, in particular, ended tragically in World War II in the Eastern Theatre and remained very disturbing for me up until several years ago. I wish to preface this with the current life fact that even though I was not raised Jewish, I was descended from European, Native American, in some Jewish lines. I knew little or nothing about Judaism. In the mid-90s, I began being unavoidably drawn to Judaism, immersing myself in the Jewish community and attending a synagogue. I also began a 2-year extension course in Jewish studies offered by Hebrew University and started studying Hebrew. At that time, I saw a therapist and asked to be hypnotized to find out more about what seemed to be memories. From that point, I began to draw pictures of what I remembered. I was startled to notice that they seemed to be parts of a story that could be arranged in order because of how old I was in each memory. As difficult as it was, I allowed myself to recall more and more, and to write down the details of what I recalled. This is my story. In that life, I was born in the late 1920s in Eastern Europe, near Prague, to an interesting family of good people. There was a brother nearly 2 years, an interesting family of good people. There was a brother nearly 2 years older than I, and a sister a little more than 3 years older. My mother was related to the Polish ruling family. My father was an agent for the Jewish resistance in what is now Israel. As they both were trying to report events to influence peace for Europe, it was a natural attraction. I suppose that you could say that they shouldn't have had an interfaith marriage in those times. But as my father told it, my Jewish grandfather smiled and sighed when he was told about his son's intentions with his future bride. Our general story, as we traveled over Europe, often in volatile cities where history's outcomes were being made, was that my father was a traveling salesman selling kitchenware. But I never saw any pots or pans, only a leather briefcase filled with papers with lots of typing. Still in that lifetime, as a girl of about 2 years old, I visited a farmhouse in southern Poland, one with a view to the north across a valley. I awakened from napping on a rug on the floor and, hearing the muffled cry of a baby, went to the window and crawled up on a wood box. I saw my mother and a young cousin taking down the laundry from a web-like winding laundry line on a pole. I could hear tall aspen and pine tree leaves clattering at the near edge of the narrow clearing. It was very windy. I noticed the laundry basket with clothes piling up in it and was concerned that the baby might be in there. I tried to call out, but the wind took my breath away. As I looked out over the valley, there were ominous clouds coming from the wrong direction. There was a vague scent of fear deep in the air that wasn't good. I didn't know it then, but it was a hint of what was to come. I think feelings such as joy, fear, anger, and so on are molecularly present in the air and are rather revealing to little tots, who are quite aware of feelings of danger or safety. In the early 1930s, when I was just a little girl visiting my Jewish grandparents near a city in Central Europe, there was a particularly bad winter. I dearly loved my paternal grandfather. He was so wise and kind, and he spoke different languages. We were crossing an icy, snowy street, and I saw a fruit tree. I was about 3, and as we went through the cold archway, I asked him if the tree would live. It seemed out of place there in the median in a high, cold city. He said, if God wants it to. A sharp wind blew through the archway and caused fear in me. Times were hard for my grandparents. My mother would take food to them whenever we visited, that is, whatever small goods she could carry, smoked from her sister's farm. Once, she, accidentally, left a pretty Russian fine woven scarf there for Grandma. Grandma's name was Lisa, but once, while visiting, I overheard my grandfather call to her one night, Leah, let down visiting. I overheard my grandfather call to her one night, Leah, let down your hair, in a soft and loving way. For a while, my mother would take us 3 children on the train to visit father, who traveled with business to different cities in Europe. He was always glad to see her. But as things got rougher, she could only take me, perhaps somewhat for protection. We met one time in northwestern Europe, Berlin, perhaps with a stout businessman. As we had no babysitter, I got to attend, as long as I was good. I was nearly always good, except when I teased my older brother. I loved my sister and him so much. I would deliberately mispronounce Peter's name as Peter, which means father, because he was always trying to imitate our father. Except for mother, we all had different names, especially to hide Jewish heritage. I was Anna Shoshana, which means Anna Rose. Sometimes, I would say, Anna SSH Anna, and I thought of it as an Anna, gram, a small measurement of me. I loved puns. Some of my days were in a residential area near Prague, mostly near mother's family. I remember the car's backward opening doors and smelly exhaust fumes. One time on the farm, as I looked up from colorful chickens scratching in the road, I watched the large, friendly family horse approaching with an elderly man who wore work clothes and was seated on the buckboard. It was a good time. It was a time of new and old, with horse-drawn carriages and new cars. Clothes were beautiful. People were beginning to recover from World War I. However, in the evenings my relatives would all gather around and listen to the radio announcements. These were hurried listenings, no one spoke. Some were seated, leaning forward, some standing with arms crossed. My favorite aunt wore a pretty flower print dress. I remember some of the announcements, the beautiful music that was played at other times, and the ing sounds as the dial was tuned to airwaves. At some point during those years, I did attend school in Amsterdam, when I was about 8 years old. But one day we hurriedly left Amsterdam, first edging along the canal using small inner tubes during a moonless night, and then on a boat with an engine. I went to sleep under a canvas and don't remember docking. At one place, mother approached a young soldier and asked if she could travel with me on the road. The soldier said, "No, madam." She asked when it would be allowed. He responded, "About 4:30 this afternoon." I suppose that he wanted to seem important and knowledgeable. It was in this way that she got information to pass along about convoys, size, and timing. However, the wind blew his coat open and his pants had a swell in them, so she began to know that she could not travel without Dad, who agreed with this, especially because of other things he was hearing. Sometimes, there was peaceful normalcy. Once, our family went to a reserve in northeastern Poland. There was a place where the tree line stopped, and grasses and lichens grew above the line. At that area was a small, round house built of grey granite boulders. There was a doorway, a little window, and a peephole. Dad said it was from the old days of the Norman invaders. The weather was good, and we slept in there. So much the better for some family work, getting poles and fir branches to form a roof for some protection from the night and morning dew. I woke up early one morning and went to the cold lake. There was an old wooden dock, and as I stepped onto it a spotted white owl became startled and hovered briefly in the air right in front of me. The owl reminded me of the way I had seen Adolf Hitler standing in his open motorcar, looking out at everyone. I was at that motorcar event, on the edge of the crowd but in an elevated position to see clearly. At another time, I was the little blonde girl to whom Mr. Hitler gave a bouquet of roses as he stopped his motorcade. I wondered how he would have felt to find out that the little curly-headed blonde girl was part Jewish. There was an earlier event, when I was about 4, at the last minute, my well-dressed parents were to go to a fine dinner restaurant that had dancing and an orchestra. There was no babysitter, so I got to go. We were seated in the restaurant, near the back of the raised floor and also near Mr. Hitler, who had his German dinner guests around him. He had an odd way of clapping, with the palms near his fingers and his fingers doing the clapping. He was sweating, drooling, and laughing, clearly enjoying a good time. I didn't like him. He seemed mean. The dark indicator happened one peaceful morning, when a young man on a postman's bike brought a letter. My brother answered the doorbell, tipped a coin to the young man, and brought the letter to my mother, who was in a housecoat. She sat down at the table and opened the letter, but something just didn't feel right. It was from a friend of my Jewish grandfather. He wrote that when grandfather didn't show up to play checkers, he had gone to inquire. He had already known that grandfather was outspoken by word and writing against Hitler's annexation of Austria, and that my grandmother had been taken away in a truck for questioning when the Nazis arrived. He had discovered my grandfather's suicide by hanging, then, together with others in the apartment, he had cut him down. After my mother read that letter, she was never the same. Was it really a suicide, or it was made to look like a suicide? I never the same. Was it really a suicide, or it was made to look like a suicide? I don't know. One of the next things I recall was that Dad got a job near an Alton house, or roadside inn, in northern Poland. He was hired as a cook and waiter, and our family was to help serve meals. We were setting up for the officials to have dinner after their meeting. Father instructed me, as someone's glass is emptying, or they want anything, you go get it. I was experiencing anger and sensing that these were bad, dangerous men. It became the only time that I ever had an outburst or that my father reprimanded me. I snapped, they should get it themselves. Father leaned over behind me and sharply whispered in my ear, do you want to get us all killed? So I did serve the guests very well following that incident. There was snow on the ground when I went down the back kitchen steps. I had heard some muffled noises from around the side of the building. I went to see what the noises were. 2 young soldiers were viciously kicking my brother, who was down in the snow. A third young soldier leaned against the building, smoking the nub of a cigarette. The 2 were kicking him in the ribs and back and face. He was not defending himself. The snow darkened with blood. It was such a sharp contrast to the snow on the boughs of the pines, which stood as witnesses while I backed up in horror. I stumbled against the wooden steps and hurt my right shoulder. After that, my shoulder always hurt, my arm was somewhat impaired, and a cough showed up whenever I was tired because of the frequent pain. We stopped working at the Alton house. Father was trying to keep his family together, and both of our parents were trying to help with the war effort. But Germany took over Poland in spite of the counter-efforts of many people. We went through a checkpoint town, staying in a temporary barracks-type house for frequent travelers. The commandant was a colonel, a kind man who didn't look at things too closely. He too was trapped in the rapidly unfolding events. One night, we left, slipping into the countryside and moving hand over hand along the routes by the river's edge. The water was too cold for me. A man offered to carry me, while I was on his back for warmth and caring. He held my child arms together at the wrists in front of him, edging carefully with his other hand. Some soldiers came along the roadway, so we were still, but we could easily hear the dogs barking and growling. However, the soldiers dismissed the dogs as reacting to a raccoon or other small river animal. They probably didn't want to go into the woods in the dark, so they moved on. We traveled on when it was safe. Arriving in northeastern Poland or western Russia by an open-door cattle car that swayed to and fro with a monotonous clack-clack sound through mountains and tumbling freshwater streams, we were to work as a family at a place where a utility was being built along a river. The snow was starting to fall heavily as we got into a transport truck. Each truck caravanned forward in the tire marks made by the previous truck's tires. Always there was the loud engine's roar, which we hoped would keep roaring so that we would not get stuck in a northern winter. When we arrived, the men and women were put in separate barracks. Ours had one stove at the end, with the potty bucket near the front door. One day, during spring thaw, my sister, about 15 by then, came home all disheveled. She had been cleaning a trailer for an officer. My parents had always previously been in tune, but this time they openly argued about staying anywhere in Europe, or even fighting for their cause anymore at all. The conclusion was that we would try to leave by railroad, going south and then eastward to eastern Russia or China. We all dressed up as well as possible in our best clothes, carrying only one small picnic case, and went to the train station, a building adjacent to the tracks. My brother wore a hat to cover the scar that had been left on his face from the beating he had gotten at the Alton house. I felt so sorry for him and wished he hadn't been hurt. The 5 of us all looked our Sunday best for a holiday. When I saw the corporal trainmaster, his lips were thin in a near smile, his eyes dark. I didn't trust him, but I knew that he was our last hope. We could only get transport in a cattle car, though it did have some soft straw. I remember seeing the familiar blue-green mountains again. The train's back and forth swaying, combined with the clack-clack noises, was soothing. I fell asleep toward evening and was vaguely aware of the train's starts and stops, of cars connecting and disconnecting. But something didn't feel right. When I awakened, there was a collection of other people on the train in the car with us. They were vacantly staring. The sun was coming through the wrong side of the slats on the side of the cattle car. We had been betrayed. Instead of going south and then east, we had gone south, farther south, then north and west to a detainees camp. When we deboarded, there were cattle chutes by the railroad tracks, which we had to walk along toward an officer. His hand occasionally motioned to some people, but it was mostly already determined who would go where. My sister went one way with other young girls into a chute that would load into a departing truck. My father and brother went another way into an open, grassless yard surrounded by barbed wire. I went another way into an open, grassless yard surrounded by barbed wire. My mother and I went yet another way. I never saw my father, sister, or brother again. My mother and I were in a barracks with other women. We were dressed in civilian clothes. I do not recall anything like tattoos. I do recall that, one day, a tall, fat sergeant came in and motioned to the women, toward my mother. There, in front of all of us, she had to lie down on the floor while he mounted her. He didn't even take his coat off. I was nearing 13, and I could feel my face turning red as my anger increased to rage. My mother would never choose to lie with such a pig. I might have jumped on his back and begun beating him, but she motioned with her hand, raising it flat in a halting motion. It gets harder for me to remember. I was left in a painted cellar room, without clothes. It was cold, but I was able to get used to it. I was not given food or water. Sometimes, a little window in the door would suddenly slide open, a woman would look at me and then slam it shut. The pipes were painted, all of white or pale yellow. There was one bare light bulb in the ceiling. I think I lost the ability to see color. I could see bars on the one high window that formed little crosses. I tried to remember everything, especially the family I loved. I thought of them again and again. I don't know how long I was there. I lost awareness. Then, I was on something like a stainless steel rolling table. I was being examined by people dressed in white lab coats. I was near death but weakly aware. There was pain, lots of pain. I think that they looked at my liver or other nearby organs and then sewed me back up. The next thing I knew, I was back in the barracks with my mother. I was lying down with my head in her lap. I could not see well, but I was able to make out other women around her. One, a friend, stood nearby. Mother told me, "Don't be afraid to die." But I wanted to live. She withheld food and water from me to speed up my death. Her friend consoled her. The next morning, a little after 10 o'clock, I awakened on top of a pile of bodies. I had been revived a little by the morning dew, and I became aware of a dirty man groping me. I was conscious of two things then: one, spiritually traveling along beautiful clouds in the sky toward a loving light, and, in an earthbound way, being cremated and then shoveled with the ashes of others into a common grave in a trench. Following that, I was only aware of indescribable beauty and love. After a while, I made two attempts to return to earthly life, one in which I did not come to full term, and another in which I was born deaf and died early in the crib. Finally, I remembered being born into this life, one in which I can in the crib. Finally, I remembered being born into this life, one in which I can remember so many details of that prior life. I think that after World War II there weren't enough Jewish homes for Jewish souls to be born into, so God sent us to the nearest possible home. For me, that was one in which I would have the incentive to remember other lives, especially the World War II past life, and gradually come to terms with those tragic events. The reason I chose to reincarnate was to try to make a difference for good, and to fulfill the life I would have had. In this life, I garnered a Governor's Award and 2 community awards for social service work with the poor, and I have received numerous other recognitions, including in teaching. The disturbing feelings of the World War II memories stopped when, in this life, I chose to become part of the Jewish community, officially becoming Jewish. Only then did I feel right, because in the sequel of this life I had become who I was meant to be. Looking at my past life, I marvel that I was able to witness key events of the drama of WWII. And, although I had searched in many places, I had wondered just why it was that I had been unable to find any pictures of my family, as we were very often right there in important photographed events as witnesses and participators. Then one day, I was watching the History Channel on television. The show was Gideon's Spies. It briefly flashed on a picture of World War II agents, which had been recently released by Mossad, Israel's Special Secret Service. There in the background was the man who had been my father. He had been an agent and a spy. That was the reason why I couldn't, until then, find historical photographs as spies. My parents didn't want to be photographed. They had mostly remained behind cameras. The television show said that Mossad only released pictures of their agents if all known family members were dead. Finally, hearing that all my family was dead, I was able to move on. There was yet another sense of freedom from the past. I reflected that for a long time in this life, I would see things through my past life sister's eyes, as she had survived her challenges. After World War II, she had traveled in Europe and was sometimes based in Paris. Then, one year, the sense of her stopped. After seeing the Mossad picture, there was a second type of closure, because I realized that all of the people I had known and loved had died and moved on. Now I continue to recall many other lives for many reasons, to know more about different kinds of things, to gain wisdom and understanding, but mostly to know about God and love. A person can survive the worst and heal if they are aware of loving and being loved. I keep the beauty, the loving if they are aware of loving and being loved. I keep the beauty, the loving kindness, and the love. They last forever. Karan Bowden. Karan's beautiful and touching story depicts the horrors of hatred and the hopefulness of love. The process of bringing peace to this planet will require courage and patience. Overcoming ignorance is difficult, yet this is the task of the enlightened soul, and we will receive lots of help toward this goal. As I mentioned in a previous chapter, life in the physical dimension is filled with pain and suffering. We cannot avoid the fact that our bodies and those of our loved ones will one day meet their ends, whether through accidents, illness, or any other cause. But the additional pain caused by the ignorance and violent actions of some people is avoidable. As more and more people become aware of their higher nature and the true purpose of their lifetimes on earth, crimes, wars, and other optional acts of cruelty will diminish and eventually disappear. We have reached a point in our soul's evolution where we can decide to end all prejudice, all hatred, all violence, and all wars. People like Karan are dedicating their lives to this purpose. And so must we. Soulmate. This is a part of Zindagi Ki Roshni consultancy. It has been established for those who have lost someone and for those who are very sad in their life. About 100 PDF books and 20 short audio books of this topic will be sent to those who join it. This data will be sent to their email or WhatsApp. If you want to join this organization, then please send WhatsApp message to this number.